In the twilight of the night, allow my voice to guide you through the shadowy streets of fear. With a wealth of wisdom amassed over a lifetime of literary explorations, I present to you 3 tales steeped in mystery, where the darkness melds with reality. In these gripping narratives, the delicate veil between justice and deception tears asunder, revealing the sinister presence of fake cops. In a world where terror lurks behind the uniform, brace yourselves to plunge into an abyss of suspense and adrenaline. Welcome, I am Mr. Vincent, where fear takes shape through carefully chosen words and the mystery unfolds in the sound of my voice. The wail of the sirens shattered the evening calm, making Jimmy startle. He was behind the wheel of his car in Florida, heading to the hotel where he was staying for a brief business trip. A shiver of nervousness ran through him as the police cruiser pulled alongside him, flashing lights and blaring megaphones. "Pull over!" commanded a booming voice. Jimmy complied, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never dealt with the police before, and the situation made him uneasy. A stern-looking officer in his 50s got out of the cruiser and approached Jimmy's window. His gaze was cold and penetrating. "License and registration," he demanded authoritatively. Jimmy handed over the documents, which the officer examined carefully. "Everything checks out," he pronounced after a few minutes. "There was an accident not far from here. We're checking all vehicles in the area. Did you see anything unusual?" Jimmy shook his head. "No, nothing," he replied with a trembling voice. "I was just headed to my hotel." The officer stared at him for a moment, an unsettling intensity in his cold eyes. "You can go," he finally said with a nod of his head. Jimmy let out a sigh of relief, but he didn't feel at ease. That inspection, the officer's gaze, everything exuded an aura of unease that he couldn't shake off. An article he had read some time ago about fake policemen luring victims to rob or harm them came to his mind, fueling his fears. While driving, Jimmy nervously glanced in the rearview mirror. Were these just paranoid thoughts? Or was the police cruiser actually tailing him? He accelerated, but the feeling of being pursued didn't leave him. Panic began to grip him as the cruiser pulled alongside him again, ordering him to pull over. Jimmy obeyed, terrified. The officer got out and, in a threatening manner, ordered him to exit the car. "Why?" Jimmy asked in a trembling voice. "Do you have something to hide?" the officer replied with a sinister smile. Jimmy shook his head, vehemently denying. "Then get out of the car," the officer repeated in a peremptory tone. Despite the fear, Jimmy hesitated, a moment of fatal uncertainty. As soon as he opened the door, 2 hooded men brutally seized him, throwing him to the ground. Heart-wrenching screams escaped his throat, but no one could hear him. He was alone, at the mercy of these 3 individuals who dragged him swiftly towards a black van parked nearby. Jimmy closed his eyes, praying for a miracle that never came. The van sped away, leaving him alone in the dust, with terror pulsing through his veins and an uncertain fate awaiting him. The van was dark and stifling. Jimmy was handcuffed and blindfolded, unable to move or see. The deafening roar of the engine and the vibrations of the vehicle in motion made him tremble with fear. He didn't know where they were taking him or what would happen to him. Terrifying scenarios crowded his thoughts. Were they criminals? Organ traffickers? Or perhaps something even more sinister? A sudden swerve of the van slammed him against the metal wall. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder, but he dared not emit a groan. He didn't want to give his captors the satisfaction of knowing he was frightened. After what felt like an eternity, the van slowed down and came to a stop. The engine shut off, and silence descended, almost surreal after the previous tumult. Jimmy felt the van door open, and 2 pairs of strong hands seized him, pulling him out of the vehicle. The cool night air slapped his face, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. He was forcefully pushed against a rough wall. The sound of footsteps moving away made him realize he was left alone. A moment later, A dim light illuminated his face. He was in a dark and narrow alley, surrounded by tall, dilapidated buildings. A tall, thin man, with his face hidden by a hood, stared at him with cold eyes. "Where have you taken me?" Jimmy asked with a trembling voice. The man didn't respond. He gestured with his hand, and two hooded figures stepped forward, dragging Jimmy towards an abandoned building at the corner of the alley. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. Jimmy was pushed inside, and the door closed behind him, leaving him alone in the darkness, with the terror now completely enveloping him. Jimmy was in a dark and damp room. His hands were tied behind his back, and his feet were bare and dirty. A nauseating smell of mold and excrement permeated the air. Two hooded figures were holding him still, while a third man, the one he had seen in the alley, approached with a threatening demeanor. "Tell me where it is," the man ordered in a hoarse voice. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jimmy courageously replied. The hooded man approached even closer, his face almost touching Jimmy's. "Don't play games with me, boy," he said with a cruel smile. "We know you have information we need." Jimmy spat on the ground, disgusted. "I won't tell you anything," he growled. The hooded man remained unfazed. He nodded, and one of the other men stepped forward, brandishing a knife. "You'll regret this," the man said, with a voice devoid of emotion. The knife's blade gleamed in the dim light, dangerously nearing Jimmy's throat. The knife was just inches from his throat. Jimmy could feel the coldness of the blade on his skin, and his breath became labored. "Last chance," said the hooded man with a cold voice. "Tell us where it is, and I'll let you live." Jimmy closed his eyes and prayed. He prayed for a miracle, for an escape route, for anything that could save him from this nightmare. Suddenly, a metallic noise caught his attention. A rat, probably, running along the pipes that crossed the ceiling of the dark room. In that moment, Jimmy noticed a small window high up, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a chance, a faint hope of escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted with all the strength he had. "And even if I did, I'd never tell you." The hooded man hesitated for a moment, surprised by his determination. Then, with a gesture of annoyance, he ordered the other two men to take him away. Jimmy was dragged out of the room and thrown into a dark corridor. His hands were still tied, and his bare feet trod on the cold floor. As his tormentors moved away, Jimmy focused on the small window. It was the only way out, his only hope. With superhuman effort, he lay on the ground and began to push with his feet against the wall. Dust and debris entered his eyes, but he didn't give up. After an agony that seemed to last an eternity, the wall gave way, and Jimmy found himself in a dark alley. Freedom was just a few steps away from him. Jimmy ran breathlessly through the dark alleys of the city. His heart pounded in his chest, and his lungs burned with effort. He didn't look back, but he knew the hooded figures were chasing him. The sound of their footsteps grew closer, and Jimmy felt pursued. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew he had to keep running. A glimmer of light in the distance gave him hope. Perhaps it was a main road, a place where he could seek help. He quickened his pace, passing by garbage bins and stray cats. The city was silent, enveloped in sleep, unaware of his desperate escape. Finally, Jimmy reached the main road. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the hooded figures emerging from the alley, just a few meters behind him. With a final burst of energy, Jimmy darted into the middle of the road, hoping to be hit by a car. Jimmy collapsed to the ground, exhausted and injured. His body ached and his mind was clouded. A police car screeched to a halt in front of him. Two officers hurriedly got out, pointing their guns at him. "Hands up!" they shouted. Jimmy obeyed, worn out and lacking the strength to resist. Jimmy couldn't believe it. Despite being handcuffed, he was safe. He felt like the luckiest person in the world at that moment. His escape had finally come to an end. Jimmy told the police everything that had happened. The hooded figures were never found, but Jimmy was grateful to be alive. As the sun lazily set over the quiet town of Princeton, New Jersey, it painted the university campuses and the tiled roofs of colonial houses in a brick-red hue. Inside a small apartment on the second floor of an old building, Madison was getting ready for dinner. Her life was simple, marked by a calm rhythm that she appreciated. She was in her final year of English literature, a course that she was passionate about and that allowed her to immerse herself in her beloved books. She was a petite girl with long brown hair and hazel eyes that often took on a dreamy look. Introverted, she preferred the company of books to that of people, but that didn't make her unhappy. She had a small group of trusted friends with whom she regularly met to discuss literature, movies, and music. That evening, as she was preparing a bagel with smoked salmon, Madison heard a knock on the door. She tensed. She wasn't expecting anyone. Intrigued and somewhat nervous, she approached the door and looked through the peephole. In front of the door were two men in uniform. One was tall and burly, with a square face and a stern demeanor. The other was shorter and leaner, with a smile that Madison didn't like at all. Both were dressed as police officers, but something didn't add up. Their uniforms looked disheveled, and their manners were too abrupt. "Can I help you?" Madison asked with a trembling voice. "Agent Johnson and Agent Miller," said the burly man, showing an ID card that Madison didn't have time to examine closely. "We're investigating a series of thefts in the area. Can we come in?" Madison hesitated. She wasn't sure if she could trust these men. "One moment," she said, and stepped away from the door to grab her phone. "Don't worry, miss," said Agent Miller, with a tone that seemed insincere to Madison. "We're just here to do our job." Madison was about to dial 911 when she heard a noise behind her. She turned abruptly and saw the burly man already inside her apartment. "What are you doing?" Madison asked with a trembling voice. "We're just taking a look," the man said with a sinister smile. Madison suddenly felt trapped. The two men were staring at her with cold eyes. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. The burly man approached Madison and forcefully snatched the phone from her hand. "No calls," he said in a gruff voice. Madison tried to break free, but the man was too strong. He pushed her against the wall and held her in place with one hand. The other man approached and began rummaging through the desk drawers. "Where are the jewels?" demanded the burly man. "I don't have any jewels," Madison said with a choked voice. "Don't lie to us," said the man in a threatening tone. "We know you have family heirlooms." Madison shook her head. "I swear I don't have any jewels," she said. The burly man slapped her across the face. "You better start talking," he said angrily. Madison was terrified. She didn't know what to do. In that moment, she spotted an open window on the balcony. It was her only chance to escape. With one last effort, she broke free from the man's grip and lunged towards the window. She climbed onto the ledge and threw herself down. Madison landed on the balcony below with a thud. She quickly got up and ran towards the stairs. The two men chased after her, but she was faster. She descended the stairs two at a time and darted out of the front door. She ran through the dim streets of Princeton, not knowing where she was going. The only thing that mattered was getting away from those two men. After running for several minutes, Madison stopped in a dark alley. She was exhausted and frightened. Leaning against a wall, she began to cry. Instinctively, she pulled her phone out of her pocket and checked if it had broken during the fall. Fortunately, it was still functional. With trembling hands, she opened her contacts and called her best friend, Sam. "Hello?" Sam answered, his voice groggy. "Sam, it's me, Madison," she said, her voice broken from crying. "Help me, please." "Madison, what's happening? Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. "No, I'm not okay," Madison replied. "There are two men chasing me. I need help." "Where are you?" Sam asked. "I don't know," she answered. "I'm in a dark alley. I don't know how I got here." "Stay calm," Sam exclaimed. "I'll track you. Just give me a moment." Sam hung up, and Madison waited, her heart pounding wildly. After a few minutes, she heard the screech of tires in the distance. Shortly after, Sam arrived in his car and stopped in front of her. "Get in," the young man said. "Let's get out of here." Madison hurriedly got into the car and Sam sped away. They didn't stop until they were out of town in a quiet and dark area. "What happened?" he asked, parking the car. Madison told Sam everything, from the two men presenting themselves as police officers to her desperate escape. "I can't believe it," Sam said, his eyes wide in surprise. "You did the right thing calling me." "Thank you," replied Madison, her voice barely audible. "I was truly terrified." Sam approached Madison and hugged her. "You're safe now," he said. "I won't leave you alone." The wind howled through the gusts of the trees, lashing against the garage windows like a pack of hungry wolves. Inside, Tina, Mark, and Dawson, three 20-year-old friends, gathered for their usual evening of board games and laughter. The garage, spacious and illuminated by a dim light, was their safe haven, a refuge away from the troubles of the small countryside town they lived in. It was around 2 a.m. when the sound of sirens ripped through the silence of the night. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows, illuminating Mark's tense face. "What the hell is happening?" Tina asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Mark replied, getting up. "But we better go check." The three friends headed towards the garage entrance, their hearts pounding. The sirens grew closer and closer until a police car screeched to a halt in front of their hideout. Two uniformed figures stepped out of the car, one tall and sturdy, the other smaller and more agile. They approached the group confidently, flashlights in hand, illuminating their faces. "Good evening," said the taller officer in a deep voice. "We received a report of a disturbance to the public peace. Can we come in?" Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure," he replied with a trembling voice. "We didn't know we were disturbing anyone." The two officers entered the garage, scanning every corner with their piercing eyes. Tina and Dawson exchanged a nervous glance, a sense of unease growing within them. "What's your name?" the shorter officer asked Tina, shining the flashlight directly on her face. "Tina," she replied in a weak voice. "Tina Lang." "And you?" the taller officer asked Mark and Dawson. "Mark Robinson," answered Mark. "Dawson Mason," added Dawson. The two officers noted down their names in a notebook, never taking their eyes off them. "What are you doing here at this hour?" the shorter officer asked, adopting an accusatory tone. "We were playing board games," Tina replied. "We didn't mean to disturb anyone." "Did you have any guests tonight?" the taller officer inquired. "No," Mark answered. "Just the three of us." The two officers exchanged another glance, then approached Mark and Dawson. "We know you're hiding something," the shorter officer said menacingly. "It's better if you confess everything." Mark and Dawson looked at each other, terror painted on their faces. They didn't know what to say or do. "I don't know what you're talking about," stammered Mark. "We haven't done anything wrong," added Dawson. The two officers got even closer, their shadows looming over the three friends like a nightmare. "One last chance," said the taller officer in a cold voice. "Confess, or you'll regret lying to us." Tina, Mark, and Dawson were petrified. At that moment, a metallic noise came from the corner of the garage. "What was that?" the shorter officer asked, shining the flashlight toward the sound. A moment of silence fell over the garage, a tense and oppressive quiet. Then, a second metallic noise echoed in the darkness. "Is someone here?" the taller officer asked, his voice trembling. The three friends looked at each other, terror in their eyes. A shiver of fear ran through them like a cold blade. "We need to get out of here," Tina whispered. Mark and Dawson nodded silently. They moved toward the garage exit like silent shadows, trying not to make a sound. The two officers were still distracted, busy searching for the source of the metallic noises. The three friends seized the opportunity to slip away, disappearing into the dark and stormy night. They didn't stop until they were sure they had shaken off the two officers. The icy wind whipped at their faces and the rain beat relentlessly on their bodies, but they paid no mind. The only thing that mattered was getting to safety. Unbridled sprints, dark alleys, panting breaths. Fear propelled them forward, adrenaline burning in their veins. They took refuge in an old, abandoned shed, huddling amidst the damp and cold shadows. There, in that dark and malodorous corner, they finally felt safe. They had escaped danger, but the fear still lingered within them. What would happen now? Who were those officers? And what did they want from them? The questions burned in their minds, but they had no answers. The only certainty was that their lives had changed forever. The sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky with a rosy light. The three friends emerged from the shed, the fresh morning air caressing them like a promise of hope. In the silence that follows the dark dance of words, I thank you for sharing this journey into terror with me, Mr. Vincent. I hope your nights are now populated by shadows and mysteries that linger in the darkness. To continue exploring this intricate labyrinth of fear together, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Activate the notification bell to not miss a single whisper of future tales. Until the next adventure, may your nights be immersed in mystery and saturated with dark emotions. Good night, fearless seekers of terror.